This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, everyone, welcome to the Community Science Long Island Ospreys and Eagles webinar. I'm just going to give everyone a couple minutes to log on. Thank you so much for your patience, and we'll get started shortly. It looks like we have a good amount of people already joined, so we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining our Ospreys and Eagles webinar. My name is Valerie. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for Peconic Estuary Partnership, or PEP as we call it. PEP has partnered with the Long Island Sound Study, New York Sea Grant, South Shore Estuary Reserve, and the Seatuck Environmental Association to host this year's Community Science webinar series. And Community Science Long Island is an outreach series aimed at raising awareness for citizen science opportunities on Long Island and the importance of these projects in supporting research and local environmental management efforts. So this particular webinar is unique in that both Osprey and Eagle populations have benefited from robust conservation and strong policy. And citizen science can help in the process of forming such management techniques and policy. So I'm happy to present our two specialists. We have Brendan Fogarty of the Long Island, who is the Long Island and New York City Regional Coordinator for the Breeding Bird Atlas 3. And he will discuss Long Island's ospreys and the Breeding Bird Atlas as a method to survey them. Next, we have Mike Vicicelli, and he is the operations manager for the North Atlantic Division of U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we'll discuss Long Island's bald eagles and the midwinter bald eagle survey. So before we begin, some housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on Seatuck's website shortly. Your video and microphones are turned off, but you're free to ask questions in the chat as we go, and those questions will be answered in the Q&A during the last 15 minutes of this webinar. And thank you so much for joining. So without any further ado, Brendan, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Just give me a second to get myself situated here. Okay, with any luck, everyone should be looking at some slides now. So my name is Brendan Fogarty, and Valerie introduced me very nicely. I wear a couple of different hats, one of which is I am one of the several regional coordinators in the Long Island and New York City region for the 3rd New York State Breeding Bird Atlas. And I'm going to be coming today with a little bit of a perspective from the Atlas in regards to how ospreys have been faring. The Atlas has been a project that is not new. It has happened before at intervals, and I'll explain exactly how we can see the osprey breeding data change over time with that. So we'll jump right in. First, we have to address the very fundamental question of what is an osprey. I don't like to assume that everyone knows everything, and I don't think one should at presenting a webinar. So an osprey is a type of predatory bird, a raptor, which is somewhere between a hawk and an eagle. They are related to hawks and eagles. They're in the same group of birds. They are often treated as having their own family, so they are a bit of a unique branch, but they have a lot in common with both. So ospreys are very well known as a fish-eating bird of prey. They specialize in fish. This is a very typical photo, and a lot of people strive to get photos like this, and this person did it very nicely. So ospreys are frequently seen fishing. They're a very conspicuous large raptor. They take fish out of any sort of body of water they're able to. And you can see their talons here. They have an exceptional ability to lock onto fish, such that they actually struggle to let go of a fish once it's in their grip. So they're very charismatic birds. And they have a pretty interesting history and global range. So the osprey is not only found in our area, it's actually found around the world, and they have varying degrees of success in all the places they live, including Europe and Asia, and even Africa and parts of Oceania and South America. They're also migratory, and we're going to look at a little bit of migratory data. Being a very large and obvious sort of bird, they are quite accessible for researchers. So we are fortunate to know a lot about them. And people who live near me in the New York City, Long Island area are also fortunate to likely see them all the time. I threw this slide in because I thought it was an interesting question that I didn't have the answer to when I started researching this. What is an osprey? What does that mean? So allegedly, there are two sources of thought here. So this is a commonly seen argument, whereas osprey comes from the two Latin terms os, which is bone, and we see that in other words. And then the Latin frangere, excuse my Latin accent, which is the verb to break. So ossifraga would mean something along the lines of a bone breaker. And so it's imagined that this was slightly bastardized into Old French and then Middle English into osprey over time. There's a parallel argument, which might not be in conflict actually, that suggests that osprey is sort of a derivation of aves prede, as in aves as in bird, and prede as in predatory. So either way, we have a predatory bird or a bone-breaking bird. Nowadays, the ossifraga, the bone breaker, is traditionally associated with the lammergeier, which is a type of old world vulture, which does look a little bit like an osprey, same idea, but very much unrelated. So osprey are very interesting in that they do have this global distribution, but they are also migratory locally. In the northern hemisphere, our birds are migratory, whereas birds that are closer to the tropics or in the tropics themselves are not migratory. What we're looking at here is a map of several different individual ospreys making their annual pilgrimage from North to South America. And so you can see them starting on the East Coast, going down Florida, making the crossing to Cuba, and then actually island hopping to various degrees all the way as far east as Hispaniola or Puerto Rico, and then deciding that the best course of action from there is to pop down straight south to Colombia and Venezuela, where a lot of them will continue their journey along the Atlantic all the way down to Brazil. So they're highly migratory, and I saw one last week, but they are in the process of leaving now. So they're very interesting birds. And now we're going to shift really quickly and talk about what the Breeding Bird Atlas is. So the Breeding Bird Atlas is something that occurs in many of the United States and in other countries. In New York State, the Breeding Bird Atlas has occurred twice before, and we're currently in our third iteration. That's why we call it the third Breeding Bird Atlas. So we have it on a pretty regular schedule. The first one started in 1980 and went for 5 years. The next one was 2000, 20 years later, and went for 5 years. And so now we are in the midst of the 2020 beginning Bird Atlas. So the basic idea of the Breeding Bird Atlas is to cut the entire state into a whole bunch of tiny squares. They're roughly 3 miles by 3 miles, and answer the question of what birds have acceptable breeding habitat in those squares. And so it gets a little complicated to answer the question of exactly what is an acceptable amount of evidence for breeding. But that's the general premise. And with data like that, there's actually some wonderful analyses that can be done for bird health overall and for a specific species. So the atlas is underway, and it's a citizen science effort. It's being hosted by eBird, and it's wonderful in that people can participate. Anyone who's using eBird can participate and provide data. So here's some stats. These are actually from earlier this year. We were looking at 378,000 checklists that had been submitted of people saying that they went out and they had a checklist of the birds they saw on that little venture. There are thousands of atlasers, over 3,000 at the time. The state has been divided into 5,700 blocks, and there was data earlier this year in 9 out of 10 of those blocks, so doing pretty well. And actually, 95% of the blocks that are designated as priority blocks doesn't really matter. It's just an analytical thing. But yeah, over 300 species have been coded as being at least possibly breeding in New York State, and then 224 have been confirmed. And of course, the Osprey is one of them. But it wasn't so obviously a breeder in New York State once upon a time. So back in the 40s, there was a new pesticide that became wildly popular called DDT. It was very effective as a pesticide, but it had a very unfortunate side effect of course, getting into the ecosystem and bioaccumulating in predators. And birds that had high levels of DDT in them had difficulty forming eggshells that were sturdy. So in general, an osprey can lay eggs in its nest, and it can sit on those eggs gently so that it can keep them warm and incubate them. But at the time, the eggs they were producing were too fragile for the parent to even tend to. So they were doing very poorly in general. They were traditionally uncommon and primarily along the coast. By 1969 specifically, active nests in the Northeast had dropped over 85% via some surveys that were done from New York City to Boston. So it was actually a rather dire situation. 85% population loss is huge. Eventually, people began to rectify the wrong. DDT was banned in 1971 in New York State, and I believe it was banned in the country around the same time. In 1983, ospreys were already doing a little bit better. They were downgraded from endangered in New York to threatened. But in the 80s, people were still certainly on edge about ospreys. And very interestingly, ospreys were introduced to parts of upstate New York in the west and in central regions throughout the 80s. A number of individual birds were brought up there. In 1995, the recovery was still slowly happening, but looking more and more promising. There were 230 pairs on Long Island in 1995. And a couple of years later, the osprey was downgraded again from threatened to a special concern species. We can really get a nice illustration of the recovery effort by looking at breeding bird atlas data, because the breeding bird atlas does coincide with the slow upswing of ospreys. So 1980 to 1985, you're looking at the breeding bird atlas data. So every square represents a block that had some sort of osprey activity. Here, the yellow squares just mean that maybe an osprey was seen. There wasn't really strong evidence for it breeding. The red squares are probable, which meant that the osprey was seen doing something that indicated it was likely going to stick around and breed, even if it was not confirmed 100% to do so. And the blue squares are where ospreys were seen to have nests. So at the time, ospreys, even in places where they are so common around me right now, they were only in eastern Suffolk County. There were a couple places in the more remote parts of northern Nassau County that had them, and they bred around the Adirondacks. But even here, we can see that they were being introduced into parts of western New York. I believe that the ones in the middle in the Finger Lakes regions, and also in Sullivan County, and they were not yet confirmed to be breeding there. However, things changed In the slide we're looking at, in the top left, we have the 1980 Atlas results again, which we just saw. And then in the bottom left, we have the 2000 Atlas. And immediately you can see the change. So ospreys are now breeding all along both coasts of Long Island, the North Shore and the South Shore, all the way to New York City, just about. They were pretty well established in the Northern Finger Lakes, in that central blue area that is sort of a east-west line is centered around Montezuma and those big wildlife refuges that have a lot of marsh up there. You even see some in Western New York State. And they held on fairly well in the Adirondacks and up by the St. Lawrence and Lake Champlain areas. So they were improving, but still slowly. It was during this atlas that I began to sort of become a birder and take note of this sort of thing. And at the time, ospreys didn't feel like a major rarity. They were very exciting to see as a new birder, but they were findable if you wanted them. And in the big map here, we finally have some data from our current atlas, which of course is not done, so the data is not finalized, but already just 3 summers in now, we've had 2020, 21, and 22. We're seeing just an incredible range expansion of the osprey, and this is probably better than it was 100 years ago. So you can see that ospreys are now seen throughout all of Long Island, anywhere that there's any coastal habitat, probably even a little bit paracoastal, if you will. So they might be inland a little bit. They are now found all along the Hudson River, and you can see between the year 2000 and 2020, that's a new revelation. And they are along the Hudson River and even past the end of the Hudson River, and they go up to Lake Champlain strongly. They're all along St. Lawrence River, and they are along the Great Lakes. And they are even in places like the Catskills, the western and southern ends of the Catskills. There are populations there as well. So the recovery has really been wonderful. They are starting to use natural nest sites again. Well, when I started birding, if you saw an osprey nest, it was on an osprey nest pole. That's all that they would use, and that was working at the time. And I remember probably just 10 or 15 years ago, I saw my first osprey that had decided to nest not on a pole, but on a sign on the Meadowbrook Parkway by Jones Beach that was going over the road. And that was pretty exciting that they were suddenly running out of real estate, because there's quite a few osprey poles in the South Shore marshes. And now a sighting like this is not too uncommon. They are nesting in trees, they're nesting on old piers, they are nesting on any sort of dry material that they might find in a salt marsh, even just a few feet off of the top of the tide. So they're really doing incredibly well. It's wonderful to see them, and we hope their recovery continues, but right now it's looking very good. They are running out of real estate. They're doing well. So for now, we are lucky to have these birds around us, and we can't get complacent. We have to keep ensuring that they are protected, keep ensuring that the food sources that they rely on, the fish in our area, are safe for them to eat, and we can hopefully keep having this really wonderful charismatic species in our area forevermore. I want to end just on this photo of an osprey nest. This is at Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx. So it just kind of demonstrates that they are really seeking any opportunity they can now, and that is a good sign. So long live the osprey. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brendan. That was fantastic. That picture is amazing. That's really great to see. All right. So yeah, once again, you can type your questions in that Q&A chat and we'll answer them at the end. But Mike, you can go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
You see my slides okay, Valerie?
Yep, you're all good.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, so as Valerie mentioned, my name is Mike Viscelli. I work for the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm a natural resource program manager in the North Atlantic Division, which kind of ranges pretty much from Maine all the way down to Virginia. And I'm going to run you through a couple of different things today. I serve as the national coordinator for the Midwinter Bald Eagle surveys. I've been the coordinator for the New York State Midwinter Bald Eagle survey for many years. And just going to kind of give you a little perspective on what we do at the Corps of Engineers. And I kind of give it with some perspective for some of the things that others can be considering for how they manage, and the people that are involved with management of birds and eagles themselves, as well as, just an understanding of what the considerations that are being given and how we're using the citizen science that we're putting together for the Midwinter Bald Eagle surveys. So the Corps of Engineers, for those of you who aren't aware, I grew up on Long Island. I live in New Jersey now, but most of the Corps of Engineers projects in our area, they end up being in the New England area or they're out in Pennsylvania. We just do a lot of coastal work along the shore. So a lot of times really the representation of the Corps of Engineers for folks out on Long Island is usually going to be through our regulatory program or any sort of coastal navigation, shoreline protection, that sort of stuff, a lot of beach nourishment. So that's where you hear us get involved. But around the rest of the country, we have 400 lake and river projects that really most of them stem from flood control. And we manage over 8 million acres of land, close to 4 million acres of water, 55,000 miles of shoreline. We have quite a bit of areas where our projects end up falling within migratory bird flyways. You got 7 of the 10 migratory bird flyways are within the flyways go over USACE waters, Army Corps of Engineer waters. One of the big things that we do at our projects is we get a lot of visitation. When we built all these flood control projects, one of the things that did was it brought a lot of people out to our projects because they wanted to recreate on these federal lands. So we get over 270 million visitors a year that come out to our projects. And as part of that, we engage a lot. We have a lot of park rangers at our projects. We engage with those individuals from the public. We use them to our advantage. We use them for citizen science. We use them for education. We use them for outreach. And that's where a lot of our beneficial work that we do along the lines of management for species like ospreys, bald eagles, things like that come into play. And a lot of our projects are really close to metropolitan areas. And I mentioned, we talked about our regulatory program. A lot of people have an interaction. When people come and they need to get a permit to do something, where they usually want to have some sort of an impact on wetlands or waterways, the Army Corps of Engineers will give them a permit for that too. And as part of that, a lot of times there's special conditions in there, and they're geared towards protecting special status species, threatened species, endangered species, things like bald eagles, ospreys, and the like. And as well, in addition to that, we do a lot of environmental restoration projects. We get involved with a lot of environmental cleanup, a lot of areas that either they've been degraded because they were old military sites. It could have been areas that are just some sort of hazardous waste sites, Superfund sites. We get involved with a lot of cleanup and restoration on those projects. And a lot of that management and the work that we do all has considerations for varying different species. And again, inclusive of bald eagles. So what does it mean? We have a lot of land. We got a lot of desirable habitat. We have a lot of opportunity to do outreach and education. And a lot of the work that we do and a lot of our actions and that we do at our projects really provides a lot of benefit for the species in their various different life cycles and life stages. We go through and do a lot of different things. You see on the lower left here, there's bald eagle management plan, right? Those are the kind of things that we get involved with. Sometimes there's very specific things that we're doing for species. Brendan gave a really great laydown on some of the impacts coming from DDT to ospreys. Same problems happen and same impacts obviously happen to bald eagles as well. Army Corps of Engineers played a vital role in the recovery of bald eagles in particular by serving as a hacking site, where they had a lot of areas where we had eaglets and then we hacked them and let them go, and they kind of started to nest naturally at our projects over the many years. We continue to manage and oversee that through a lot of the work that we do every year with our annual surveys. Big one being the Midwinter Bald Eagle survey. We do a lot of the breeding bird surveys that Brendan was talking about, levy surveys. We support a lot of our local regional efforts. A lot of the folks that I heard on the call, the folks that are hosting this call, a lot of the involvement for the people that they're dealing with, those are a lot of the partners and folks that the Army Corps of Engineers is working with in all the different local areas outside of not just Long Island, but around the country. But similar approach happening in all these different areas across the country. And that's one of the things that I think is really impressive. When you see the amount of work that's going on, and we think a lot of times in our localized areas, and then you step back and you see what's going on at a national level and how all this stuff ties together, that's a really important part of the work that we're doing. And it's a really important part of the citizen science and the work that you all can be a part of, right? We are taking a look at our local area, but all that stuff is being gathered and put together, and it's having a landscape and a regional and a global look on a lot of that stuff. And that's really an important thing to not lose perspective of. And I think that's one of the things that I really try and encourage people to get involved and be a part of stuff and understand that the work that they're doing does have, bigger implications than just, I filled out a data sheet. I went out and looked at some stuff. Sometimes people are kind of loose about doing stuff. It's providing really important information. And I'm sure Brendan could probably tell you a lot of the stuff that he was working on and, that he's dealing with is probably along the same lines. So it's really important to have that support for the work that we're doing. I mentioned nest monitoring a little bit before. We do a lot of that stuff out on our projects. We're starting to, do a lot of GIS mapping. We do a lot of restricted areas. Again, part of it for education and outreach, part of it just to make sure we're protecting the species themselves. A lot of different types of habitat management. I mentioned outreach. One of the things we do at a lot of our projects is Eagle Days. You're starting to see it more. You don't see it as much in the Northeast. You see it a lot in areas across the country, but they'll actually have days where they have people come out and they'll have folks putting on programs to do outreach, just really to get the public to understand the benefits of these birds, to understand the impacts, to understand that, that what they do has a meaning, right? The work that folks are doing, or they're working through citizen sciences, working through with their states, just the stuff they're doing at home and how they manage things, that they can have some really beneficial impacts on a lot of these species, bald eagles being one of them. Starting to see some of these increased populations in some of these areas. You're starting to see some of these things pop up along the Hudson River. They got a lot of eagles up there. I've seen a couple local towns have had some small little Eagle Day type things up there. And then a lot of it's planning, right? A lot of the work we do is our master planning and how we oversee our sites at the Corps of Engineers, but we do a lot of stuff with Department of Defense and the military training lands. But a lot of it comes down to that data that we're gathering, sharing that stuff with Fish and Wildlife Service, other folks that are managing those species, folks at the state level. And then working on different things to kind of look at a perspective and again, try and get our folks in our agency to work with others in other agencies. We're working on memorandums of understanding on how we're going to do that work and what we're doing, taking a look at the different regulations that are out there. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is an executive order that goes with that basically says that all these different agencies should be doing good things for birds, right? Putting together best management practices and challenging our folks to figure out when there's things that are going on at our projects that we can be doing better so we can be avoiding and managing those impacts. And a lot of that comes through education. And a lot of it, like I said, we have a lot of folks coming out to our projects and getting those people to understand that their actions can have adverse impacts on these species. So a lot of that is really getting out there, reaching out to the public and being a part of that and educating. So that's kind of a little background on what we do at the Corps of Engineers and a little bit of an overview of how we use some of this stuff. I want to jump in and talk a little bit specifically about the Midwinter Bald Eagle Survey. This survey has been going on since the late 70s. When they first put it together, the National Wildlife Federation was kind of the driver behind it. They were looking to determine eagle distribution during the winter. They want to look at different habitats they're using in the winter to see what it was out there. Again, this is, if you think about this is back in the late 70s. As you saw from the slides that Brendan showed, we're starting to get into the recovery stage and trying to figure out what we were going to do to benefit these birds going forward and where they were going to be at. So you have to think about that's kind of when this all started, and we've been gathering that information ever since, 40 plus years. And then a big part of it was to get an overall estimate of what the winter bald eagle population in the lower 48 states looked like. Right now, we go out and we do the surveys through citizen scientists, through states, through federal agencies. We have a number of different people that do all these different surveys across the country. And it's been managed by varying different agencies to kind of keep this thing afloat. And a big part of it, like anything else, comes down to funding, right? The federal and state governments, they never really have the money they need to do everything. So National Wildlife Federation handled it for quite some time, and the Bureau of Land Management took it on, and it ended up with the National Biological Survey, went to the US Geological Survey. And then since 2008, the Army Corps of Engineers has been the ones that are handling it. When we went through the whole process, the Corps of Engineers, we were getting close to what we thought was going to be the end of the midwinter bald eagle surveys. And a couple of years back, we kind of started to dip down and say, hey, this is going to be the last year, funding and run out and all that sort of stuff. And all of a sudden there was an interest in continuing it on. So we lost a few years, and we're really trying to reinvigorate that. And that's one of the things that, having a group of folks like you all on the phone here today, I think is important to give you an understanding of what the surveys are, what their intentions are, to help get your support and understanding of what we're trying to do and what we've been doing for 40 plus years now to continue to gather this information. So you can see here, these are the sites across the country. This is a few years old, this slide, but you can get an idea there. These are the sites where the survey routes have been done every year. Long Island, we only have a few sites out there. Wertheim usually does one. I'll get one or two random ones here and there from some citizen folks, and then I'll usually get one or two that kind of trickle in from the state, but they're kind of hit or miss from year to year what we get. And a big part of the Midwinter Bald Eagle survey is making sure that we get that consistency from year to year in those surveys so we can get that data that we need. A lot of the work that we're doing is partnerships, right? We're working with all these different federal, state agencies, NGOs, universities that are helping to put all this stuff together to manage the data, to do the analysis of what we actually are getting from this data. So what do, right? So for the Midwinter Bald Eagle survey, we actually go out and we do field surveys. We have standard survey routes. We standardized them back in '84 because they realized that, we were getting hit or miss surveys from year to year, and the data doesn't do you very good unless you have consistent data over an amount of time. So what they did is they said, hey, we got to come up with these standardized routes. So they did that. They've been collecting that data, and for many years they've collected them on data sheets, and people send them in, and we've been putting them in some sort of an online database. And it's been a little bit loose, right? And that's one of the things that we've been struggling with, is how do we get better with the overall data collection? How do we get that consistency? How do we pull all that stuff together? So we've been working and pushing to get better at that over the last many years. We ended up having state coordinators. We have a national coordinator. And one of the things that they're responsible for doing is QA/QC the data, make sure that we're getting the information we're looking for, making sure that the records are gathered, and then getting them over to the statisticians who are doing the analysis. For every 5 years, they've been going out and doing trend analyses, right? So they've been taking a look and seeing, similar to the slides that Brendan had, of what were bald eagle populations looking like back in the 80s and the 90s and on up, right? So one of the things to do that, it's really important that we have specific criteria to give us that consistency. So we were looking at surveys that were done for 4 years in a row and had more than 4 eagles in them, right? If the survey was only done once in 4 years, or there was only 2 eagles for all 4 years, they didn't consider that from a statistical standpoint important enough to put into the mix. They only wanted to look for, because it's a midwinter bald eagle survey, they only wanted to look between the dates of January 1st and January 25th. They wanted to make sure we're doing it consistent in the same areas from year to year. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff that came into play. And one of the problems we found is there's been a lot of inconsistency, a lot of incomplete surveys, a lot of, 1 year you get a survey, 1 year you don't. 1 year you get a survey that has 5 eagles, 1 year you get one that has none. So a lot of times they're doing it different ways. 1 year the states were helping for a lot of these. They would go out and they would fly with a helicopter. The next year they didn't get funding and they go out and they do it by car. So those are the kind of things that we've been trying to strive for, that consistency, because that's all that helps in the trend analysis. If you're doing stuff the same way over the same routes, the same amount of time, you get that consistency and you can get that fidelity in the data that helps to get to the results that you're looking for. So from 86 to 2015, we had 988 routes that we've been doing for the Midwinter Bald Eagle survey across the country. Like I said, only a handful of those, give or take, on any year coming from Long Island. But we ended up having in New York, we probably had, for the entire state of New York, close to 50 to 60 routes in any 1 year. You see the Northeast, they have 175 routes total. That would vary, but you can see here this annual percent change. It was one of the biggest percent changes out there. And that was one of the struggles, is we were getting the surveys, but we weren't getting them consistently. And that was kind of driving the data that we had. But this kind of just gives you an idea of what the findings were. So over those many years, taking a look at it, we've been seeing definite trend analysis, or definite trends when they're doing the analysis of bald eagle populations. So you can take a look, you can see these red states and the pink states down here have been decreased, or a significant decrease. And you can see up here in the Northeast, we've had significant increases. And there's been a lot of analysis to take a look and speculate as what that may be from and why. Part of it having to do with habitat, part of it having to do with human assistance, part of it having to do with agriculture. There's a lot of different angles on what it might be. So there's a lot of different analysis and a lot of papers out there that take a look and think about these sort of things. But this is a good kind of demonstration of what the information that's being gathered is being used for and how that all comes together. So as I mentioned, we've been looking at a whole bunch of this stuff, published a whole bunch of different documents off of the data that's been collected from it. It's been driving these different studies and analyses, 15-year trend analysis, 20-year trend estimates, looking at 30-year trends, looking at post-DDT recovery and subsequent early effects of density-dependent population, right? They're looking at, are these areas where some of the eagle surveys are going up? They tend to be in areas that are more densely populated. And they're kind of saying, what is that all about? What does that make sense for, right? We're in the Northeast and we have high populations, but the bald eagle surveys seem to be going up. Is there some sort of a benefit that humans are providing or benefiting to them? And in some cases there are, and there's been proven that, there's some nesting habitat and things like that we've been doing that have been helping them. Whereas in some of the other areas that are not as densely populated, that maybe they have some other effects because of the way that the agriculture is being managed or, the habitats being managed that's out there. So there's a lot of different perspectives on those things, but there's a lot of different papers that look at all that sort of stuff. BSU is Boise State. We've been working with them. They've been a really big supporter of the work that we're doing. They've been taking a look at the trend analysis, have a couple different speculations on, eagles reaching carrying capacity after years of population gains in a lot of areas across the country, increasing in the Northeast. I showed you those graphics that show kind of what it is. There's some speculation. Could part of it have anything to do with climate change, right? And that could represent why we're seeing more wintering eagles in the Northeast during those times. Climate change is having an impact on that. And the future of what it holds for the bald eagle survey, we look to continue to work them. We do them every year. It's every January. There's usually a target week with a couple of target days. For those who aren't familiar, it's usually, the first or second week of January. We're always looking to get more people to come out and do surveys, continue to use this data to help write management plans, guidance. The Avian Knowledge Network has been a big resource for where we're looking to store our data that we're getting from it. There's some varying different citizen science projects that are going on out there, public education and awareness. States are using the information, high schools, a lot of different federal use for the surveys and the information that's coming from them. So the last thing I really just want to touch on is, I mentioned before that one of the struggles that we've had over the many years is the data and the consistency. So we're working right now to kind of get a little more modernized with the bald eagle surveys that we're doing during the winter now. And we're working on web-based or app-based tools. So you can go on your phone, fill in a survey form, click the button, and it submits it to a repository that goes onto the Avian Knowledge Network, and now that data will be stored there. Whereas in the past, you would go out, you'd fill in a data form, you put it in an envelope, you'd send it to your state coordinator would take it, they would enter the computer system, it would get surveyed, QA, QC'd by somebody else. Sometimes they didn't get put in, sometimes you couldn't read the people's handwriting. So we're looking to fix all that stuff. And on top of it, GIS has really been something that's been up and coming for the last many years. GIS is a mapping tool, for those who aren't familiar, where you can go in and you can have your routes in there and you can make them consistent. So we're really looking to start reinvigorating the surveys, to get the support, to get our surveyors out there in the field back up and running. So if people are interested, Valerie has my information. She can send out my email, reach out to me. I'd love to get more people doing surveys, especially out on Long Island, if anywhere else in New York for that matter. So we're looking to keep on pushing that. This is just kind of a little peek at what the survey tool is going to look like. So if you take a look here, you can see, we're going to have some mapping that'll be in there. You kind of fill in just some general stuff. It's very simple. It's going out, doing some observation, capturing what you're doing, how you're doing it, putting it all together, pressing the submit button, taking a few pictures. And, most cases people enjoy doing it. They get out there for a little bit and, it's time well spent out in the field, and it's getting us some really good data that we're able to use to pull all this stuff together and continue to do these trend analyses. So that's all I had. Just wanted to give you a little background on the survey itself and a little bit on what the Corps of Engineers does. I'm happy to answer any questions. And if anybody ever has any questions down the road after today, feel free to reach out and shoot me an email. I'm always available.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Very, very informative. So we have a lot of great questions. We'll get to as many as we can. All right, so the first question for Brendan, will the population of ospreys adapt to, their numbers to the available real estate that's available to them? Is that something that's clear, just like solely based on habitat, or is that something that's more limited by like prey? So go ahead.
That's a great question. I don't think I can give a very satisfactory answer to that. It does seem like right now the population has been increasing very strongly in the last few years in particular, and they are using as much real estate as they are able to. They are still mostly breeding and sticking to the particular habitats that they are known to use. In my area, that's coastal salt marsh, and really that they aren't branching out from there. But there have been some notable examples of other bird species which have suddenly adapted to other habitats. One good example is common raven. 20 years ago, common ravens only were able to be seen in New York State in the far corners of the Adirondacks in remote, inaccessible spots. But they are doing well, and they are now breeding down here. So I don't know. I don't know what's next for the ospreys, what the limit is going to be to their growth. But at this point, we're just happy to see them doing well.
Okay, thank you. And from Melissa, are ospreys off the protection list? You had mentioned, I think, that they were a species of special concern. Are they off completely now?
We'll look that up real quick. I don't know that they're entirely off. According to the Department of Environmental Conservation, federally, they are not listed at this time. In New York State, they are still special concern. So they are at risk to sea level rise could be an issue. They do tend to nest above the sea level line, so they're not as exposed to that threat as, let's say, salt marsh sparrows, which nest just inches above the tidal line, sometimes below, unfortunately. So that's where they're at now.
Okay, and two osprey questions from Ellen, all grouped together. After a season, do osprey offspring migrate with their parents? And do they return to the same nest year after year?
So what we do know about osprey migration is that they do, as well as they can, are able to return to the same nest. The males are known to arrive a little bit earlier in the spring. They will get there first, and I guess they start to develop the nests, and the females will arrive after. I don't know that the immatures might fly south with their parents. I tend to think not, because at hawk watches, they're usually seen going by individually, which is standard for raptors. So I don't think they would continue a close family tie, and they'd probably have to go around and find a new nest later in a subsequent year.
And how many eggs are typical of one osprey season?
I don't know what the exact expected number is, but they lay a pretty small amount of eggs. I personally don't get to look into osprey nests very much, but I do get to see osprey nests that have had chicks that have hatched fairly recently quite a bit. And we frequently see 2 to 3 chicks. That is pretty normal. I think 4 would be a little surprising. And I don't tend to see just one. So it's, I'd say 2 to 3 would be the expected number of chicks that grow up to survive to their first molt and start looking like an adult.
Okay, great. And Mike, is there any data on possible effects of bird flu on eagles, since eagles will take waterfowl for prey?
Honestly, I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't get closely enough involved to understand those parts of the whole science of that bird flu stuff. I haven't been involved with that very much.
Definitely something to be looked into. And we have a question from Wendy. So for Brendan, I understand that you have over 3,000 atlasers that get data. how can you be sure that the number of people getting the data is the same every year? If more people get involved or less, how does that affect comparing the data?
That's a great question. And I usually give talks about the Atlas. This is where I met Valerie at an Atlas talk, and I could fill up an hour easily talking about, about how that works. So essentially the idea is that for every block, or in this case, to make it a little bit easier, really focusing on every third block, I won't explain how that works. But it's randomly and evenly distributed spatially across the state, which is supposed to help for data analysis. So for a given block, let's say the one I'm in, we have the full 5 years to document breeding for any bird species. So if in 2020 I saw some ospreys, but they didn't nest, I can mark that down. But maybe in 2021, someone else who lives near me did find a nest around here. And then that osprey is officially confirmed as breeding in my block at home here. And then that's sort of done. So then we can all go and look for ospreys in a different block. So the idea is it is a cumulative effort. It doesn't have to be the same number of people participating every year. Some people could participate just 1 year. If they move out of state, that's totally fine. We're looking at the 5 years in total. So even that could mean, let's say that there's a marsh and there's ospreys nesting there, and it could be developed, or it could flood, or something could happen. At the end of the Atlas, we'll still say, oh, well, there were ospreys nesting there. So we can mark that as them being there, even if it might not be true for every single year. So we're looking total 5 years.
Yeah, definitely seems like it gets a little bit complicated on the data side, but thank you so much for that answer. From Elizabeth, we have a shout out to Rachel Carlson. Yes, definitely fantastic citizen scientist and political advocate. So go Rachel. Then we have a question from Melissa. She wonders why there's no bald eagle data from Florida. She believes their population is high there.
Yeah, it's oftentimes it really just has to do with individual interest and having a state coordinator that's active in reaching out to get people to do those surveys. So a lot of times you'll see some states have inconsistent, or they'll have low numbers for people that are doing the surveys. That's usually what it is. It doesn't have anything to do with the populations of the birds. It's really more getting the individuals and having people to rally the individuals to go out and do the surveys.
Okay, thank you. And then from Debbie, we live in Vermont. Do you have any idea why there is no one participating in the survey in Maine? I think you pretty much covered that too, unless you have more specific answer.
Nah, same answer, yeah.
Okay. So we will be sending a follow-up email after this webinar with resources for both of these presentations, Bob. And then from Skip, as a wildlife rescuer, discarded fishing line has been a major problem with osprey entanglement. How can we better get the message out to the public to make them more aware of this risk? On a side note, Peconic Estuary Partnership does have throughout the East End monofilament fishing line receptacles where fishermen can drop off their used fishing line, and then it's sent to be recycled rather than just disposed in the garbage, or even worse, in our waterways. So working on those types of programs and doing more outreach for programs like that, I would say. Mike or Brendan, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that is the best way to go. I've been involved in local Audubon chapters that have sort of promoted actually using young people to get involved, which was just a great syzygy of everything coming together. Promoted using the monofilament receptacles in places where there's a lot of fishermen. So just giving them access for that proper disposal, that's the best I know of.
Yeah, and we do it at a bunch of our projects too, and really it's twofold. One, it's the actual area to place the stuff so we can get it out of the environment, but it's also an educational component, and that kind of tells people, hey, this is a bad thing, put it here and here's why, and we could put a little educational message on those. So we see like that's what most of the other ones have too.
Absolutely. So working on educational programs such as that. We do have from Gwen Schroeder. Thank you for joining, Gwen. We have a comment, one bald eagle was reported to succumb to bird flu in Suffolk County, unfortunately. So that's definitely something to look into more. And thank you for that information. From Christine, are there rivalries between male ospreys for prime nest locations?
I'm glad you asked that. So their ospreys seem pretty friendly as birds of prey go in general, but they are certainly very conscious of territories, and they become quickly very agitated if a human were to enter their territory, even if they're nesting on a pole. I believe I'm very interested to see how territories for ospreys go in the future. Through CTUC, I've been doing surveys in the salt marsh of southern Nassau County on Long Island. And just this year, we had a very interesting phenomena, which is that there is, amongst other things, actually a peregrine nest box that is also placed on a pole out in the marsh. It doesn't look like an osprey nest platform, which is just a flat surface. It looks more like a birdhouse, but a very large birdhouse, about 2 or 3 feet long, with a covering, and the peregrines will nest in that. And the peregrines have nested in that particular birdhouse for many years, and they did it this year as well. And birds of prey tend to fledge their young earlier in the season. So the peregrines left the nest box at some point, probably by the summer. The young were all gone and hunting elsewhere. And at the end of the summer, we did a survey. I guess it may have been the end of August or September, and an osprey had put quite a number of sticks on top of the peregrine falcon nest box, which is something we've never seen. They've definitely never done that with that box, which is there. But I think it's getting very competitive, and I think it's very interesting because, like the raptors, osprey nest fairly early in the season. They don't wait that long. They might wait a little bit longer and have young in the summer, whereas a lot of raptors will be finishing up in midsummer. But I think just to see an osprey building a nest at the end of the summer, surely with no intention of using it this year, that might be a good indicator that it's getting really tight out there. So I wish them all the best of luck. And I don't think they're going to outcompete the peregrines, but we'll see how much damage they did to the nest box next spring. An interesting problem to have.
That's so interesting, like they were practicing for next year. Okay. So next from Bob, I'm helping a local school district install an osprey nest on town-owned property near the school, along with support from the group for the East End. What should I do to include our observations to this project? Would that be like an eBird observation once they do sit in the nests?
Yes, and I will make sure that in the follow-up document that Valerie is going to send out to everyone, there'll be some instructions on how to participate in the atlas. It's not terribly hard. It requires a fairly low level of tech savvy to just participate and submit your sightings, but they are all valuable, so we absolutely welcome them. So there will be instructions.
Okay, great. And Diane, you kind of predicted Brendan's stories. Diane said, will eagles and ospreys nest near each other? So possibly something that will begin to happen.
That's a good question. I don't know of any eagle and osprey nests that are very close to each other, but eagles are also doing well in my area of southern New York State. So they are certainly at odds to some degree. Maybe Mike knows more about this.
Yeah, no, same thing like you said, Brendan. I've witnessed the same thing. As you'll see them in the general vicinity, but they definitely seem to keep their distance and they have their respect for each other. And you won't usually see them right on top of each other. Usually seem like they have their own hunting grounds, and I think they kind of, I don't want to say outcompete each other, but they'll fight a little bit if they're in the same area trying to chase each other down. Because especially the eagles, they're nasty. They go and they'll take anybody else's fish that they can get. So usually they tend to have a little bit of space between them, but they will be in the same general vicinity for sure.
They are certainly in direct competition, and the eagles are definitely quite well. They're definitely larger, but ospreys are a very large raptor too. So it might be a little bit more even than we might imagine out there.
Okay, great. And a question from Robert. If we see a bald eagle in an unusual location, would reporting it on eBird be a problem? Would you be concerned that curiosity seekers might annoy or harass the bird? So people might try and track down that location if it's reported.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the things that's always kind of up in the air, but I don't think there's enough people that are really following eBird to the minute to get that sort of stuff. I definitely encourage you to put it in there. The more information and data we have in there, the better off it is. I can tell you, we just went through today, we're working on whooping cranes down the central part of the country and migratory habitat for stopover habitat. And they went in eBird and they pulled a whole bunch of reports to see where they were going and what people were seeing. So that sort of stuff is being used, going from citizen sciences to the federal and state agencies that are managing that stuff. So it's really important information. So I think you're better off to put it in there and, take the chance that more than likely there's not too many people that are sitting back waiting for it. And most people that are, they're well intended as opposed to looking to cause more problems. I think Facebook does more problems with those sort of things. When people put them on some of those sites, they seem to all gather on them.
The people at eBird are certainly aware of the risks of potentially reporting a specific individual bird to a precise location. And for example, whooping crane's a perfect example. If you try to look on eBird for sightings, they're actually obscured. So you can't really see up-to-date information on that species. That's not the case for bald eagles or osprey. They are doing quite well now. And we're at the point that if someone wants to see an eagle today, it isn't terribly hard to figure out where they might go for a good chance, or maybe to see a nest that is either in use or old. So I don't think there are safety concerns for individual birds in terms of osprey and bald eagle at this time, at least in the tri-state area. It might be different somewhere else, but they're okay.
I think that every birder I've met seems to have very good ethics, so I'm not concerned about the eBird reporting. Okay, so we're almost out of time. I'm going to end with one comment and one question. Andrea's comment: we've seen osprey managing the time and location that bald eagles are trying to fish, but the bald eagles seem to do okay working around the times and location that the ospreys are active, so maybe they can cohabitate. And a question from Barry: I have a platform out his back window on a North Fork Creek. After 5 years of breeding osprey, no action for the past 2 summers. Do you have any thoughts? Will they come back, or will others take over the nest?
That's interesting. I would say that the chances of that nest platform being rediscovered, possibly by maybe an ancestor of the birds that used it, perhaps they have died from old age. There are some perils that ospreys face on their migration. They're not really hunted, but they do visit fish farms on their way to and from places, and people will defend their fish from them because that is an obvious conflict. So it is possible they are pretty long-lived, but that could be. But I do think, given the state that I'm seeing on Long Island of real estate competition, that I'd be surprised if you didn't have one nesting there next year.
I hope that you have some good news for us next year. Okay, I'm so sorry that we didn't get to all the questions. I'm so happy to see everybody so enthused about the Ospreys and Eagles here on Long Island. So as a reminder, a follow-up email will be sent with resources from both of these presentations. The recording of this webinar will be up on CTUC's website soon. Additionally, feel free to visit the Wildlife Monitoring Network Long Island website with some more wildlife surveys you can participate in. And I just want to say, Mike and Brendan, thank you so much for your time. Those presentations were excellent, and you're both doing really incredible work. And thank you to all of our attendees. It's super heartening to hear about the wonderful survey work going on and the enthusiasm Long Islanders have for their wildlife. So thank you so much, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Take care all.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thank
Have
you.
a good night.
Bye-bye.